How many times have you avoided love for fear of losing something even greater? Nicholas Whitmore hurried out of the top-floor elevator, the sound of his shoes echoing across the impeccable marble floor of his immense penthouse. He pressed the button on the remote, causing the automatic curtains to open to reveal Manhattan's most iconic view, the Empire State, illuminated against the cold December sky. But Nick barely looked at the spectacle. His eyes were glued to his cell phone screen as he typed instructions in a dry, direct tone. "I need this report before 3, he said, without leaving room for a reply. The apartment was decorated with minimalist elegance, but devoid of any trace of Christmas. No garlands, trees, or twinkling lights. Nick didn't see the point in celebrations. Christmas was for families, for people with emotional ties that he didn't have. Christmas only echoed the loneliness he had carried since his parents died in an accident when he was just 12 years old. Meanwhile, a few miles away, Sarah Collins adjusted her scarf around her neck as she crossed the busy street with a hot coffee in her hand. The wind bit her cheeks, but she couldn't help but smile as she passed a Christmas tree decorated with hundreds of golden lights. People sang around her, singing a chorus of Silent Night, and the sound seemed to warm something inside her. His smile disappeared as he looked at his watch. She was late for her shift at the community clinic, and there was a stack of patient papers waiting for her. Sarah loved her job, but it was also a constant reminder of the difficulties in her life. The salary barely covered the household expenses, where his sick mother needed constant care. Still, she refused to complain. Christmas had always been a time of hope for Sarah, and she clung to it like a buoy in troubled waters. Back at the office, Nick looked at the day's agenda. A benefit dinner to raise funds for needy families was scheduled for the evening. He sighed deeply. He hated these events. Pretending to be friendly while shaking hands and giving out fake smiles wasn't something he was good at. But as CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, it was an obligation he couldn't avoid. Sarah, on the other hand, was facing her own busy day. The clinic was full, with children laughing and patients swapping stories as they waited for their appointments. A small artificial Christmas tree was set up in the corner, decorated with decorations made by the community's children. Sarah felt her heart sink as she saw a girl place a gift under the tree with a tag that said, "For those who need it more than me." As the afternoon progressed, their worlds began to come closer together without either of them realizing it. Sarah received a call from the clinic director, an opportunity to represent the institution at that night's charity dinner. At first, Sarah hesitated. She didn't have time or money for formal clothes, and the idea of being surrounded by rich people made her feel out of place. But the director insisted, and Sarah, as always, gave in. As night fell, Nick stood in the Whitmore Plaza event hall, surrounded by lush decorations and a constant hum of conversation. He circled around like a ghost, shaking hands and greeting faces he forgot as quickly as he saw them. But when Sarah entered the room, something about him changed. She was wearing a simple blue dress, borrowed from a colleague, and her eyes roamed the room with a mix of fascination and nervousness. Nick saw her before she saw him. There was something different about her, something that made him stop thinking about the late report or the next forced conversation. Sarah felt the weight of his gaze before spotting him. When their eyes met, it was as if the surroundings had diminished. The imposing man she recognized from the news, the CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, was looking directly at her. She swallowed hard, trying to catch her breath and remind herself that he was just another man. But Nicholas Whitmore was never just another man. Sarah held the wine glass with a trembling hand as she looked at the details of the room. The golden lights from the chandelier reflected on the silver decorations spread across the tables, creating an atmosphere that seemed straight out of a movie. The conversations around them flowed like a constant current, voices mixed with laughter and formal murmurs. She felt out of place, like an intruder in a world that wasn't hers. She adjusted her blue dress, hoping no one would notice that the zipper was a little tight, a reflection of her recent attempt to save even on clothes. Sarah took a deep breath, deciding that her presence there was not to please, but to represent the clinic that meant so much to her community. Across the room, Nicholas Whitmore stood near a head table, greeting guests with the same mechanical politeness as always. He smiled, shook hands, made occasional comments, but he felt out of place, as he always did at events like this. Then something caught his attention. She was on the other side of the room, her eyes fixed on the decorations. But there was something in her posture, a mix of nervousness and determination, that made him stop. He tried to focus on the conversation beside him, but his eyes seemed magnetized to the woman in the blue dress. When she finally turned her head and their eyes met, Nick felt a curious pang of recognition, even though he didn't understand why. Sarah also noticed the moment. Nick's penetrating gaze made her quickly look away, her face heating up as if she had been caught in something forbidden. Who was she to attract the attention of a man like him? A CEO, someone who probably saw people like her as just indistinct faces in the crowd. Still, something in his eyes made her heart race. Nick approached without haste, like someone crossing an invisible battlefield, measuring each step. When he stopped in front of her, Sarah looked up and felt the air around her heavy with his presence. "Good night," he said, his voice deep and controlled. "May I ask who brought you to this event?" For a moment, Sarah was speechless. She didn't know how to answer that question without sounding insecure or out of place. "I'm from the community clinic," he began, adjusting his posture to appear more confident than he felt. "I was invited by the director to represent our work." Nick tilted his head slightly, as if processing her words, but his eyes didn't leave hers for a second. "It's good to see someone here representing a real purpose," he said, his tone softer than usual. This kind of honesty was rare in their interactions, and he realized it as he spoke. Before they could continue, an older man called Nick in for a chat, and he walked away, but not without giving Sarah one last look. She, in turn, felt weak in the knees. Her mind told her it was just a chance encounter, but something inside her insisted that this moment was more significant than it seemed. Later that night, Sarah met Nick again, now at a table shared by several guests. He was laughing at something a colleague had said, but when he noticed Sarah had sat down, his expression changed to something more focused, almost inquisitive. The conversation flowed among the guests, but Nick found opportunities to direct some questions to Sarah. "How does your clinic work? What led you to work there?" Her every answer seemed to fascinate him more. She spoke with passion and authenticity, something he rarely saw in those around him. On the other hand, Sarah began to realize that Nick wasn't just the cold, distant CEO she imagined. There was a genuine curiosity in their questions, an interest that seemed to go beyond the social conventions of this type of event. As the night came to an end, Sarah left the room feeling lighter, but also more confused. Something about that encounter had moved her deeply, but she couldn't allow herself to create expectations. Nick was, after all, someone from a different world, a world she could never reach. Nick, meanwhile, stood in the lobby as the guests dispersed, Sarah's words echoing in his mind. He didn't know why, but he felt like there was something about her that he needed to understand. Something that could perhaps even fill the void he had carried for so long. Sarah straightened her white coat, her heart racing as she waited at the Whitmore Plaza reception desk. The immense building, with its glass facade reflecting the first rays of sunlight on a freezing morning, looked like an intimidating monster. She looked at the clock, taking a deep breath. It was her first official meeting as a corporate wellness program consultant, and she knew the man in charge would be there, Nicholas Whitmore. Since the charity dinner, he hadn't left his thoughts. It wasn't just the way he made her feel small compared to the luxurious surroundings he commanded. There was something in his gaze, that mix of curiosity and intensity, that made her question what he saw when he observed her. The elevator door opened with a muffled sound, and there he was. Nick, impeccable in a dark gray suit, entered the lobby with the poise of someone who is always in control. His eyes immediately met Sarah's, and he gave a curt nod. "Good morning," he said, his voice as calm as ice. "Are you ready to transform the health of my team?" Sarah forced a smile, feeling the tension in the air. "Of course," she replied. "I'm excited to present the ideas we've developed." The elevator took them to the 32nd floor, where the main meeting room was prepared with organized folders and a projector already in operation. Sarah sat at the opposite end of the table from Nick, aware of his presence like a gravitational force in the room. The meeting began with Sarah presenting the program's concepts: regular stretching breaks, healthier options in the cafeteria, a space for relaxation. As she spoke, Her eyes avoided Nick's, but she felt he was watching her every movement, every inflection in her voice. When she finished, he leaned forward, lacing his fingers together on the table. "It sounds like a solid plan, but I don't see anything that differentiates this from any other common wellness initiative," he said, his voice as sharp as a blade. "Why should my team take this seriously?" Sarah felt her face heat up. She knew he was demanding, but the way he challenged her ideas made her feel like she was being tested. She took a deep breath before responding, choosing her words carefully. "Because it's not just about productivity, Mr. Whitmore. It's about valuing people. When employees feel cared for, they do their best, and that benefits everyone." Nick kept his gaze fixed on her, but for a moment, something in his expression changed. He seemed almost surprised by her response, as if he hadn't expected such firmness. "Interesting." That was all he said before closing the meeting. In the following days, interactions between them remained tense. Nick seemed determined to test Sarah, setting up unexpected meetings and questioning every detail of the program. He wasn't overtly rude, but there was an almost cruel precision to his words, as if he was looking for flaws. Sarah, however, refused to back down. His every comment challenged her to think more deeply, to defend her ideas with more passion. And although she wouldn't admit it, there were moments when she noticed something other than criticism in Nick's eyes, curiosity, maybe even admiration. One day, after another tense meeting, Sarah decided to confront him. They were in the coffee room, the informal atmosphere a contrast to Nick's usual stiffness. "Can I ask something?" she said, her voice firm but cautious. Nick looked at her, surprised by her direct approach. "Of course," he replied. "Why do you seem so resistant to this program? I mean, it's not just a corporate strategy. It's something that can really make a difference." Nick was silent for a moment, as if considering his answer. Then, he gave a small smile, but it was void of humor. "Because I don't believe in changes out of obligation," he said. "People only change when they need to, and that usually happens too late." Sarah felt the weight of his words. For a moment, she saw past the confident facade and saw a man carrying something that seemed much bigger than he was willing to share. As Nick left the room, Sarah was left alone, trying to process what had just happened. She knew there was more to him than he let on, but she also knew that trying to understand him was dangerous. He was like a storm, magnetic but destructive. Nick, on the other hand, walked back to his office with his mind full of conflicting thoughts. Sarah intrigued him, her passion, her determination. Even the way she challenged him, everything about her was unlike anyone he had ever met. But he also knew that if he didn't keep his distance, he might get lost in something he wasn't prepared to face. Snow fell gently on the streets of New York, covering everything in a silent white blanket. Shop windows sparkled with Christmas lights and decorations, and the distant sound of Christmas bells filled the air. Sarah walked through the outdoor market in Bryant Park, holding a cup of hot chocolate. She had decided to accept the clinic director's invitation to represent the wellness program at an event hosted by Whitmore Enterprises. As she walked, Sarah looked at the decorated stalls, filled with handmade decorations and holiday sweets, trying to soak up the spirit of the season. But his heart was restless. Since she started working on the show, her interactions with Nick had left a mark she couldn't ignore. He intrigued and frustrated her in equal measure. When Sarah arrived at the main event area, she saw Nick in the distance. He was surrounded by a group of executives, laughing and talking with the natural confidence of someone who was used to leading. He wore a long black coat that highlighted his imposing stance, and even from a distance, there was something about his presence that made her stomach turn. Nick, in turn, noticed Sarah immediately. She was wearing a simple red coat, the fleece-lined hood framing her face. He watched her walk through the market, her expression alternating between curiosity and slight anxiety. For a moment, he found himself smiling, something rare and unplanned. After he said goodbye to the executives, Nick walked towards Sarah. When she saw him approach, she felt a rush of nervousness. She straightened her shoulders, trying to appear calm. "I didn't know what to expect from him outside the office." "Sarah," Nick said, his voice calm but firm, "do you like this kind of thing?" He gestured towards the market. She shrugged. trying to look relaxed. I like. It reminds me that Christmas can still be magical, even if life isn't always. Nick tilted his head, intrigued by her response. He didn't know much about Christmas magic, but there was something in her tone that made him want to know more. And you? She asked, surprising herself at her own boldness. Is this the kind of thing you enjoy? Nick laughed softly, but there was a hint of melancholy in his voice. I generally try to avoid it. It seems like everyone pretends to be happy at this time, and I've never been good at pretending. Nick's honesty surprised her. For the first time, she saw a crack in the impeccable armor he wore. Before he could respond, a voice on the microphone announced the start of activities. There would be an ice skating rink open for guests, and Sarah noticed the sparkle in the eyes of the children around her. Have you ever skated before? Nick asked, changing the tone of the conversation. Sarah laughed, shaking her head. Never. It looks like fun, but I think I'm a little clumsy for it. Nick smiled, and something in his gaze softened. Let's find out then. Before she could protest, he had already grabbed 2 tickets and led her toward the dance floor. On the ice, Sarah held on to the sides of the rink as if her life depended on it. Her legs were shaking, and she glanced at Nick, who was sliding in with surprising ease. He stopped next to her, offering his hand. Trust me, he said, his voice calm and encouraging. She hesitated, but for some reason she held his hand. His fingers were warm, firm, and she felt a strange sense of security. Nick guided her across the ice, patiently, until she began to get the hang of it. Soon, they were laughing together, something that seemed both natural and unexpected. As they skated, Sarah began to relax. She saw a side of Nick she'd never imagined. He was patient, almost kind, and seemed genuinely happy, if only for a few moments. After getting off the ice, the two sat on a nearby bench, their cheeks red from the cold and fun. Thank you for that, Sarah said, looking at him. It was unexpected. Nick gave a small but genuine smile. I guess sometimes the best things are. The conversation flowed more easily after that, and Sarah realized she was seeing a side of Nick that he didn't show to many. On the other hand, Nick was attracted to something in Sarah that he couldn't name. There was a sincerity about her, a lack of pretension that made him want to lower his own defenses. When the night ended, Nick offered to walk her to the subway. As they walked, the city lights shining around them, they both felt an unusual warmth, something that went beyond the festive atmosphere. When they said goodbye, Nick stood there for a moment, watching her disappear into the station. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Sarah, in turn, climbed the subway stairs with her heart racing, wondering what exactly was starting between them. Nick sat at his large mahogany desk, staring at a budget report he could barely focus on. He had spent the last few days trying to ignore the rush of thoughts about Sarah Collins. Something about her had seeped into her controlled routine, like a melody you can't stop listening to. She was different, not just because of the way he spoke passionately about his work, but because he seemed carried by a world he didn't understand, a world of struggle and sacrifice. When he learned, indirectly, that Sarah was facing financial difficulties caring for her sick mother, he felt an uneasiness that he couldn't explain. He was not the type of man to get involved in his employees' personal problems, but something compelled him to act. Nick called his personal assistant, Evelyn, a woman he could count on for discreet tasks. I need you to arrange payment, he said, without looking at her. A fund to support Sarah Collins' mother's medical expenses. Evelyn hesitated, surprised by the unusual request. Do you want her to know where she came from? She asked, trying to gauge his intention. No, Nick replied quickly. Make it look like it came from a community initiative. I don't want her to know I'm involved. Meanwhile, Sarah was sitting at the small dining table in her apartment, reviewing bills with a frown. The figures seemed to dance before her eyes, and she felt the familiar wave of frustration and despair rising. Her mother slept in the next room, and Sarah knew that any savings she made were redirected to securing the necessary medicines and care. When she received news that a windfall fund would cover her mother's medical expenses, her initial reaction was relief. She cried with gratitude, imagining that someone at the clinic might have run a secret campaign to help her. But when he began to investigate, he realized that the origin of the background was surrounded by silence. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Whitmore Plaza, determined to set the record straight. It wasn't difficult to put the pieces together. Nick was the only one with the means and motivation for something like this. And the thought that he might have interfered in her personal life left her torn between gratitude and humiliation. She found him in his office, reviewing papers with his usual focused attention. "Can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice firm but low. Nick looked up, noticing the intensity on her face. "Of course, Sarah, between." She walked in and closed the door, crossing her arms as she tried to control the emotions that were boiling inside her. "It was you, wasn't it? The fund that magically appeared to help my mother." Nick leaned back in his chair, measuring his words carefully. "I didn't do it to get recognition, Sarah. I did it because you needed it. But I didn't ask for your help," she replied, her voice rising slightly. "Nick, I work hard to support myself and take care of my mother. I don't need anyone to treat me like a charitable cause." Nick stood up, approaching her with slow but steady steps. "You don't understand," he said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "It's not charity, it's respect. Respect for everything you do and everything you endure alone." Sarah felt her eyes burn, but she refused to cry. She didn't want him to see how vulnerable this made her feel. "You had no right, Nick. The help I give my mother is something that defines me. When you interfere, you take it away from me." Nick hesitated, realizing that although his intentions were good, he had crossed an invisible line. "I just wanted to make things easier for you," he said finally, the sincerity evident in his voice. But to Sarah, the gesture, however well-intentioned, felt like an invasion of something deeply personal. She looked at him, and for a moment, she saw not the confident CEO, but a man who didn't fully understand the consequences of his actions. "Thank you for your intention, Nick," she said, her voice colder now. "But that doesn't change the fact that you shouldn't have done this without talking to me first." Nick stood by as Sarah left the office, feeling more vulnerable than he ever remembered. He wasn't used to being questioned, much less rejected for something he had done with good intentions. Sarah, on the other hand, left the building with a heavy heart. Part of her knew Nick was just trying to help, but the other part felt as if he had challenged something essential about who she was and how she approached life. That night, as Nick looked out the window of his apartment at the city lights, and Sarah tried to find peace in her small home, they both felt that something had changed between them. They didn't know if it was a crack or the beginning of something deeper, but they knew that the balance between them would never be the same again. Nick stared at the ceiling of the dark room, the muffled sound of New York traffic coming in through the windows. He had become accustomed to silencing the thoughts that came before bed, but tonight was different. Sarah's words echoed in her mind. "You had no right." He had done things in his life without asking permission, decisions that affected hundreds of people every day. But this was the first time he felt like his meddling had reached something deeper, something he might never be able to repair. He rolled over in bed, the Egyptian cotton sheets cool against his skin. Why did Sarah bother him so much? He had already met people who needed help, who even begged for it, but she wasn't like them. Sarah was strong, determined to take care of everything herself, even when the weight was almost unbearable. Was that what attracted him to her? Or was it the fact that, by her side, he felt more human, more real? Across town, Sarah sat on the small couch in her living room. A cup of tea cooled in her hands as she looked out the window, watching the snow fall gently. Her mother was sleeping in the next room, and the silence was almost deafening. She wanted to believe she was right in confronting Nick, but there was something about his expression during their conversation that continued to disturb her. He looked genuinely confused, like he didn't really understand why she was hurt. But more than that, there was something in his eyes, something she didn't want to admit, a loneliness mirroring hers. Sarah shook her head, trying to shake the thought away. She couldn't afford to let someone like Nick Whitmore into her life. He was from another world, a world of privilege and easy choices. She couldn't risk her heart for someone who would never understand the true struggle of survival. The next morning, Nick walked into his office with the same confident stance as always, but something inside him was broken. He caught a glimpse of Sarah in the hallway, explaining something to a group of employees. His voice was firm, but his face was tired. She didn't look at him. Later, Nick met Evelyn in the lobby and asked to rearrange her schedule. "I need to leave this afternoon," he said, with a tone that allowed no questions. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask why. Nick found himself walking the streets near the clinic where Sarah worked before joining the company. It was an old building with weathered walls, but there was something about it that felt welcoming. He didn't know what he expected to find there, but he felt like he needed to understand more about her world. Meanwhile, Sarah tried to concentrate on her tasks, but her mind kept returning to Nick. She hated to admit it, but there was something about him that made her question everything. Why was he so determined to help her? And why did that make her feel so vulnerable? In the evening, Sarah went to the Christmas market to get a simple gift for her mother. The cold air seemed to clear her thoughts as she strolled between the stalls, taking in the sounds of bells and children's laughter. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice. Sarah. She turned around and found Nick standing a few feet away from her. He was without a suit, wearing a black coat and scarf. He looked human, almost out of place in the festive setting. "What are you doing here?" she asked, trying to hide her nervousness. "I needed some time," he replied, his eyes fixed on hers. "And you?" She shrugged. "Looking for something for my mom. I can't spend a lot, but I still want to do something special for her." Nick hesitated before speaking. "Can I accompany you?" Sarah looked at him uncertainly, but something in his expression made her agree. They walked through the tents together, in silence at first, but little by little, the conversation began to flow. Nick asked about her childhood, and Sarah told stories about the simple but loving Christmases she shared with her mother before the hardships became more intense. "And you?" she asked, feeling bold. "What were your Christmases like?" Nick paused for a moment, looking at the lights of a nearby tent. "They weren't like yours," he finally replied. "My parents were always busy. Christmas was more of a formality than something magical." His honesty surprised her. She saw something in his eyes that seemed so familiar, a longing for something he never had. As they continued walking, Nick stopped at a stall selling decorated glass balls. He picked one up, his fingers gliding over the hand-painted glass. He handed it to Sarah. "For your mother," he said, with a small smile. "A special gift." Sarah hesitated, but something in the simplicity of the gesture made her accept. "Thank you," she said, her tone softer now. They continued walking, and when they said goodbye, there was a new tension in the air, something unsaid, but deeply felt. Snow fell softly outside the large window of Nick's office, creating a contrast to the quiet, meticulously organized interior. He was standing still, hands in his pockets, watching the twinkling lights that were beginning to appear over the city at dusk. It was the kind of scene that should bring peace, but his chest felt tight, as if a storm was brewing inside him. Since the night at the Christmas market, something had changed. He felt it every time he thought about Sarah, about how she had accepted that small gesture with a shy and sincere smile. Something in him seemed to crumble and rebuild itself at the same time. She was unlike anything he knew, someone who seemed to illuminate a side of him that he thought had been erased long ago. Sarah, on the other hand, was in the clinic's makeshift office, reviewing papers as the clock struck almost 8 in the evening. She tried to concentrate, but Nick's presence in her mind made it impossible. He had been unexpectedly kind that night at the market, but the feeling that there was more to his actions wouldn't leave her. When she received an email asking her to come to Whitmore Plaza that night, Sarah hesitated. The topic was vague, something about adjustments to the wellness program, but she knew Nick would be there. Despite everything, she went. The moment he entered the building, he felt the December cold being replaced by the luxurious warmth of the lobby. The receptionist guided her directly upstairs, where Nick was waiting for her in his office. When Sarah opened the door, she found him with his back turned, still looking out the window. He turned slowly when he heard your footsteps, his eyes shining with something that seemed to mix determination and vulnerability. "You called me," Sarah said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Nick nodded and gestured for her to sit. "There's something we need to discuss," he said, his voice deep and controlled, but with a hint of hesitation. Sarah sat in the chair across from his desk, watching as he walked over and sat down as well, his elbows resting on the desk. For a moment, silence settled, tense, almost unbearable. Finally, Nick took a deep breath. "I want to tell you something about me," he started, his fixed eyes on hers. "Something that may help you understand Why am I as I am?" Sarah leaned slightly, surprised. He looked so safe and untouchable, but now there was a visible crack. She remained silent, letting him continue. "I lost my parents when I was a child," said Nick. The low but firm voice. "It was a car accident at Christmas." The words hovered in the air as an unbearable weight. Sarah arrested her breath, feeling a wave of empathy and surprise. "I was in the car too," he continued, turning his eyes briefly as if the weight of memory were too much. "I survived, but I lost everything that night. Since then, Christmas has never been the same for me. It's just a reminder of what I lost." Sarah felt her eyes burning, but held her tears. She wanted to say something, but the words seemed inappropriate. Nick looked at her again, as if looking for something in her expression. "That's why I distance myself from people, Sarah. It's easier not to cling to, don't feel anything. But you." He stopped, as if the words were difficult to articulate. "You make me want something different. Something I don't know if I can have." Sarah felt her heart accelerate. He seemed so vulnerable, so human, that she almost forgot her own pain. But then something about her stirred a memory, a pain she also carried. "Nick," she started, her voice shaking slightly. "I know what it is to lose something. Not like you, but..." She took a deep breath, staring at her handy hands on her lap. "My father left us when I was a child. My mother worked a lifetime to support us. But I always felt that something was missing, something I could never replace." She looked up to find Nick's, who were now fixed on her with an almost overwhelming intensity. "I learned never to depend on anyone, because no one is forever." The silence that followed was not empty, but loaded with a mutual understanding that words could not express. They were connected by their losses, their pains, and somehow brought them closer than any gesture or conversation could. Nick leaned slightly, the smoother voice now. "I didn't know that about you." Sarah gave a small melancholy smile. "It is not something I usually share." For a moment they just looked at each other, as if they tried to decipher each other's layers. There was a clarity there, a silent acceptance that both carried scars that shaped who they were. Finally, Nick broke the silence. "Sarah, I don't know where it takes us, but I want to try. I want to understand what it is, really care." Sarah felt her heart tighten. She wanted to say yes. "I wanted to believe this could work." But fear was still there, like a constant shadow. "Let's go slow, Nick," she finally said, her firm but kind voice. "We both have things to solve, but I'm willing to try too." The relief on Nick's face was palpable. He nodded, a small smile appearing on his lips. At that moment, with the snow falling silently outside and the heat of a real connection filling the environment, something has changed. It was not just two people trying to understand each other. They were two injured souls finding a refuge in each other. Nick felt the sharp cold of the night on his face as he walked along the snow-covered sidewalk. He was without his driver, an impulsive choice that seemed appropriate after the conversation with Sarah. The streets of New York were agitated with Christmas shine. Adorned showcases, sparkling trees, and the melody of chorals echoing in the distance. But for Nick, everything seemed calmer, as if he was seeing the world with new eyes. Sarah's confession had deeply stirred him. The way she had described her childhood, the loneliness masked by force, was something he visited viscerally. For the first time in years, he felt that someone really saw him, not the CEO, not the rich and powerful man, but the boy who had lost everything and learned to build walls to protect himself. The next day, Sarah was in the clinic, reorganizing papers on the small office table. The environment always brought her comfort, but at that moment, her thoughts were far away. She was reviving every word of her conversation with Nick, every expression on her face. He seemed so vulnerable, so different from the impassive man she had known at the beginning. Could she trust him? Opening her heart was a risk, something she had always avoided, and yet something inside her whispered that he might be worth trying. As she worked, her phone vibrated. A message from Nick. "I'm going to the clinic. I would like to see you." Sarah felt her heart accelerate, but answered simply, "Okay." Shortly thereafter, Nick appeared at the clinic door, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a hesitant smile. The contrast between its impeccable suit and the simple environment of the clinic was almost comic. But Sarah could not fail to smile. "He brought reinforcements," he said, handing him one of the glasses. Sarah accepted, feeling the heat of the coffee in her cold hands. "Thanks, but what are you doing here?" Nick shrugged, looking around. "I wanted to see where you work. I thought this would help you understand more about you." Sarah didn't know how to answer. His sincerity was disarming, but it also made her feel exposed. As they walked through the clinic, Nick asked simple questions but carried a genuine curiosity. "How many people do you serve per day? How can you balance everything?" Sarah responded patiently, showing the details of the work and how each decision was a little effort to make a difference. When they arrived at the room where the children waited for care, a little girl ran to Sarah, hugging her legs. "Aunt Sarah, look at the drawing I made for you." Sarah smiled, bending down to look at the colorful paper. "It's beautiful, Mia. I will hang it on my table." Nick watched the scene silently, noticing how Sarah seemed to shine in that environment. He had never felt so shifted and at the same time so inspired. After they left the clinic, the two walked side by side through the snowed streets. Sarah looked at Nick, feeling that something was about to be said, something that could change everything. "You are different from what I imagined," she finally said, her soft voice. Nick stopped, looking at her with a serious expression. "Different how?" "Like someone who cares, despite everything. Someone who tries, even if it is difficult." Nick smiled slightly. "You may be teaching me to try, Sarah." That phrase was in the air, heavy and full of meaning. They kept walking, but the distance between them seemed shorter with each step. In the following weeks, the two started spending more time together, sometimes in casual meetings, sometimes at company events. Small gestures began to stand out. Nick holding the door to Sarah, she bringing him coffee during meetings, both laughing at jokes that only they understood. But despite the growing closeness, there were moments of hesitation. Sarah still felt the weight of her responsibilities, while Nick struggled with the idea of giving up the absolute control she always had about her life. One night, as they walked through Central Park illuminated to Christmas, Sarah stopped abruptly. "Nick," she said, turning to him, "it looks too good to be true." Nick frowned, confused. "Why do you think this?" "Because I know how these things are over. People leave, Nick. They always go." He held his hands, his thick gloves preventing direct contact, but the gesture was still firm. "I won't go, Sarah," he said, with an intensity that almost made her believe. But was that enough? Sarah was sitting in the living room of her small apartment, the flashing lights of a makeshift Christmas tree illuminating the atmosphere. The smell of mint tea filled the air, but she couldn't relax. Nick's words in the park, so sincere and intense, echoed in his mind. "I won't go, Sarah." He seemed to believe it, but how could she? Life had already taught him that no one is forever. She looked at the clock. It was almost 7 o'clock at night, and Nick had insisted on finding her later. He didn't explain why, he just said he needed to see her. Part of it wanted to cancel, avoid the risk of more intimacy. But another part, one silent but insistent, wanted to see him more than anything. Across town, Nick was in his office, sitting in front of a small package wrapped in gold paper. He held the present as if it were a fragile object and meaningful. It was simple, but he knew he represented much more. Nick felt the weight of his decisions, and the conversation with Sarah in the park had solidified something in his mind. He needed to prove he was willing to stay. When he arrived at Sarah's apartment, the night was already dark and the snow was beginning to fall again. He adjusted the scarf before knocking on the door, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. Sarah opened the door, surprised to see him carrying the gift. She retreated to let him in, watching as he took off his coat, his hands shaking slightly. "What is that?" she asked, pointing to the package. Nick took a deep breath before speaking. "Something for you, but before opening, I need to say some things." Sarah felt her heart tighten. She nodded, guiding him to the couch where they both sat down. The Christmas tree beside it blinked gently, throwing shadows over his face. "I know you have reasons not to trust me," it started, the lowest voice than usual. "I know life was not easy for you, and I know it's probably hard to believe when someone says it will stay." Sarah crossed her arms, trying to protect herself from the vulnerability she felt. "Nick, it's not just about you. I don't know if I can handle it." Nick shook his head, as if waiting for that answer. "It's not just about dealing with you, Sarah. It's about us. I know I look like someone who has everything under control, But the truth is that you showed me that I don't know anything about how to really connect with someone." He paused, looking at the gift in his hands before giving him to her. "But I want to learn, and I want to learn from you." Sarah took the package, her hands hesitating before tearing the paper. Inside was a small box with a delicate glass Christmas ball. On its surface, the words were recorded, "No one needs to face everything alone." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Nick, He held her hands, interrupting her. "No need to say anything now," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I just wanted you to know I'm here, and I will continue here, even if it takes." Sarah felt a warmth grow in her chest, a mixture of fear and hope she didn't know how to process. As much as he wanted to protect himself, something in Nick, in his actions, in his vulnerability, made her want to risk. "I'm afraid too," she finally admitted, her voice trembling. "Fear of hurting me. Fear that in the end, everything collapses." Nick smiled softly. "Me too, Sarah, but maybe we can face it together." They were silent for a moment, their hands still intertwined, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt that maybe, just maybe, wasn't alone. The snow fell thick and silent on the Rockefeller Center, covering the sidewalks with a white cloak and making the world quiet, more intimate. The Christmas tree in the center shone like a lighthouse of hope, decorated with thousands of sparkling lights and a gold star that seemed to touch the sky. Sarah was there in the crowd, but she felt completely alone at that moment until he heard a voice that made her heart stop for a moment. "Did you really think I would lose this?" She turned and found Nick stopped a few steps away, her dark snow-spotted hair, her eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made everything rest disappeared. He had his hands tucked in the pockets of his black coat, and his hesitant smile was as disarmed as the first time she saw him. Sarah felt a knot in her throat. For a moment, it was speechless, the cold of the air mixing with the strange feeling of warmth that his presence always caused. I didn't know if you would come," she said finally, her voice almost a whisper. Nick stepped ahead, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "I said I would be here, Sarah, and I meant that." She looked at him, and for the first time realized how different he seemed. There was still confidence, control, but there was something more human, more vulnerable. It was as if the barriers he always carried had finally broken. "I used to think that Christmas was just a reminder of what I lost," Nick began, his low but firm voice. "But you showed me that it may be more than that, which can be a beginning." Sarah felt her tears burn in her eyes, but this time she didn't try to hide them. "Nick." Before she could say anything else, he held his hands. His thick gloves could not hide the firmness and warmth of his touch. "I want to be part of your life, Sarah. Not just today or at Christmas. I want to be by your side on every difficult day and on all good days." His words hovered in the air, as heavy as the promise they carried. Sarah felt her heart tighten, but not fear. It was something else, something she hadn't felt for a long time. Hope. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Because I can't handle another loss, Nick." He held her face between hands, her eyes meeting his. "I was never so sure of something in my life." Emotion overwhelmed her, and before she could hesitate, she stepped ahead and hugged him. The around the world disappeared as he wrapped her in his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing he had ever known. The crowd around the tree began to count in unison for final lighting, but to Sarah and Nick, time seemed suspended. When the lights of the tree came on, illuminating the night sky with vibrant colors, Sarah looked up, feeling that something inside was lightly light. Nick looked at her with a soft smile, and she realized that that smile wasn't just for the moment, but for her. "You saved me, Sarah, and I promise I will never let you carry the weight of the world alone again." She laughed, a light, tearful laugh. "And you taught me that sometimes letting someone get in is enough to share the weight." As the snow fell around them and the city's lights flashed, Sarah felt it was exactly where he should be. It was not just the end of a cycle, it was the beginning of something new. That night, as they walked hand in the streets of New York, they both knew the future would not be perfect, but it would be shared. And for the first time, that was more than enough.